So today I wanted to talk about a book that I've just read. It's called The American Frugal Housewife. It was written in 1832 and it's by Lydia Maria Francis Child, and I just downloaded it on my Kindle for free. So if you have a Kindle, you can definitely download it for free, being frugal. Um, so I just wanted to talk about some tips that I learnt from it. Some of it was a bit old and, a little bit outdated. Don't get me wrong. It was great to learn about the history and about, a different way of life, and also to listen to her opinions and outlook on being frugal. And obviously families, how they live their lives. So some of the things that she talked about, some of the tips were basically things like, especially in the kitchen, in sort of like, washing your clothes, caring for your clothes. One thing she would talk about is foraging. So learn to forage, gather berries at different types of season, and also like different sort of herbs you can get. She also talked about getting herbs and how herbs and different types of plants can also benefit your family, as in, when the cold and flu season set in, it can sort of help with those sort of things, and then hopefully avoid having to, get into something serious health issue and having to call the doctor, which is obviously another expense. There was other things in the book which talked about basically, running your household in a way where you can get the most out of your food, as in meals. So, for example, get the cheapest cuts of meat, which a lot of people know for those who do eat meat, and then you can make them go, a bit further as well, because you're getting more for, the amount, and also, you can put them in things like stews and soups and things that can, stretch it a little bit more. Then she would say, get the bones, of course, and then make that into broth or stock. I personally always gather my veggie peelings and then I put them in the freezer, and then when I'm ready, I pull it out and then I make veggie stock with that. Other things she would talk about is obviously looking after your clothing. So something we know, which is very basic, but she would talk about, learning how to sew, keeping buttons aside, keeping thread aside, so you can always repair things and allow time to repair things. So when you have to wear it, it is done. Otherwise you won't wear it or get use out of it. Another thing she would talk about is, if you had a dress or a shirt or a napkin or whatever, you could change the color of it by dyeing it, and then, or even curtains, change the color of them by dyeing them. And she would talk about natural ways of dyeing, which I thought was really interesting, because a lot of people are getting back to the natural ways of doing things and not using toxins. So she would talk about things like in your spice cupboard that you could put into water, and, with a certain way you could make natural dyes out of it. She was also talk about things like, getting potatoes and making starch out of that. So like when you're ironing and you want like a stiffened collar, you could use potato starch for that. I know my nan used to talk about how she used to do that all the time and make that up. That has really come back into fashion now is buying in bulk, with the sort of low waste, zero waste movement, but also to save money as well. And she would talk about, don't buy things by the gallon, buy things by the barrel. So she would talk about buying in bulk, setting it aside, and then using that throughout the year instead of buying small portions, which usually would cost more. And then with food, she'd say always check your pantry, your fridge, see what you already have to use up for meals, and then if it's about to go off, then use that up as well quickly, with whatever you're making for that night, so nothing really goes to waste. About trying to use less dairy products if possible, because these can also be higher priced, especially if you're not living on a farm or close to a farm. She would talk about eggs, for example. If you had eggs for a recipe, maybe you could, do using less eggs, or, if you're making a quiche, maybe you could use like half the recipe instead of the whole recipe. You don't have to use everything for it. Another way she would talk about bulking up things would be getting potatoes, boiling them up, mashing them down, and then putting these in cakes and breads, and that would make them go a bit further and you wouldn't have to use as much flour. So I thought that was really interesting, as I haven't heard that one before. about saving like little things like paper and string and wrapping paper, because these all things that can be resent. Like you can, send a parcel, or you could wrap a present, or you could keep things, in jars and bottles. Especially bottles, keep those aside and you can make other things in them. So for example, she talked about if you get brandy, you can make your own vanilla essence, your own orange essence or lemon essence to put in cakes by simply putting in like a vanilla pod into some solution of brandy and then letting it steep, and then that's your vanilla essence. She would talk about things like that as well. And she said that usually it would be better to make your own bread and cakes than buy them. Some cases I would definitely agree in our modern times, and some cases no. But the one thing I like about making things from scratch is that you know what you're putting in your bread and cakes and what you're feeding your family, and having no nasty additives or preservatives. If you have things in your household, how to care for them to make them last longer. For example, how to clean glass and how to make things shine, how to bring certain things back to life, like leather or even old petticoats, which you would talk about how she could make them soften or stiffen them. She would talk about things like how to wash certain items to care for them, to make the fabrics last longer. She'd talk about things as well, like, for example, if you had a nice piece of wooden furniture, you could get linseed and then polish it with linseed instead of getting expensive wood polish. What I really loved about the book is that she talked about, even though it was 1832, she talked about things that really apply, like as in opinions and observations of her time that would apply to now. So for example, she talked about how people are starting to get travel fever and how people want to travel the world, and there would be travelers coming through town or their country town, and they would talk about all these foreign places that seemed amazing and other people would want to go. But obviously, that would be above their means to travel. And she had this really great quote. It said, if it's cheap, you say it's cheap to travel, but it's even cheaper to stay home. And it can be true. I know that I personally have had friends and family who have taken out a lot of debt to travel these days. And, they come home and they've got this big loan they have to pay off, and yet they've still got to live their life. So I thought that was really insightful. The thing she would talk about is, especially because it's more about housewives, she would talk about young women who didn't have the skills, or even young men who didn't have the skills to look after a household, to cook, to clean, how to manage finances, because, especially the middle class of that time, because a lot of these middle class families wanted them to marry in a higher financial bracket. So basically, a lot of these young women would be taught manners and how to speak and how to write and be educated in music and languages. But, the parents would be hoping they would be in the household that they would have a servant to take care of all the cooking and cleaning and looking after the children and all those things. But she said in her time, she observed that some of these women, even if they did marry that little bit better above their household station, they could possibly, under things happen in life and they could fall into hard times, and these women wouldn't know how to be frugal, how to live below their means, how to have that little bit of savings aside. And, they would say things like, oh, but my parents took care of that. And I thought that was really interesting, as I thought that's something only applied to today, but she talked a lot about that then as well. Had a big emphasis on looking after yourself and being healthy, because if you're healthy and you look after yourself, take exercise, then you don't have to hopefully visit the doctor as much because you have taken care of yourself. I do want to talk about something which I thought was really, really meaningful. She spoke about how it is so important to be happy with the situation you're in now, with your family, your friends, the things you can afford, things you do have in your house. in your situation, because otherwise it, can create unrest and unhappiness. And she talked about how a lot of people wish they could be above their station, above, you know, their class that they're at. They could have all these dreams of this, or, traveling, or having a bigger house, or all those things. And they're not even happy or grateful for where they are now. And, it affects their whole demeanor and personality and their outlook on life. So I thought that was really important, because that also applies to today. She also touched on, there was she saw there was in 1832, there was a lot of middle class young couples, or just newly married couples, that had a house, and they would furnish it with all these fancy objects that were a bit above what they could afford, and did not put emphasis on things that they really needed to budget for. So, and they were living above their means. So I really thought that was interesting as well, that people still had these sort of tendencies even back then. I think we do forget these things. If you enjoyed those tips that I've picked up from reading the book, I will link it below for those interested in, maybe you could find your library, or maybe, like I said, you can download it for free. There's a lot more in it. Some apply, some don't apply. But it's definitely interesting read, even that on history as well. I would love to hear from you. Do you have any tips or tricks that you apply in your life that are frugal, that have been passed down, or skills learnt that have been passed down that save you money? Or maybe they're even a bit more healthier but save you money as well. I'd love to hear from you. So comment below, and I will talk to you very soon.